Thanks everyone for being here with us today. Today the topic is fading job site supports, and it's probably one of the most critical parts of our job site training and supports. But before we really get into some of the specifics about fading our job site supports, I want to do a little quality check with you. And it's basically about thinking about what do we need to make sure happens before we start fading. And this is the time for you as an employment specialist or job coach, and I'm going to use those words interchangeably, probably more you're going to hear the term employment specialist. What are we doing on those job sites? And let's do a little reflection of our own behaviors. And I decided to think about this in three ways. How are we being exclusive, intrusive, or inclusive? So when we think about the term inclusive, we really are thinking, as Webster defines it, as excluding all others, not shared or divided, sole. We have that exclusive right, or more importantly, we are excluding certain people as for economic or social reasons. So at this point, think about some of your work on that job site, and are you exhibiting behaviors or strategies that may make the individual with the disability, the employee, more exclusive? So I think about sometimes about exclusion plus excuses equals exclusives. Because sometimes I hear job coaches or employment specialists say to me, well, we've always done it that way. That's just the way we do our work. Our company tells us to do that. And so what I want us to get away from is those exclusives. But let's think about some of those activities that may make us be more exclusive. So here's just a few examples for you to think about. When you enter into that job site or when you're on there, are you considering the company's typical hiring, orientation and training, compensation package, or work roles? Quite often, if we're being exclusive, we are not considering how does that company, that specific company that you're in or business, typically hire their individuals. What is their typical hiring procedures? What is their typical orientation and training procedures? Who does the training? Who does the orientation? What about the hours that most typical employees work? What is their typical wages or benefits? And how about the work roles? What about the employment specialist being seen as that expert and not using some of those company supports? Again, are we being more exclusive when we do not consider the company's typical workplace supports, or the employment specialist being seen as that expert, that they know all, they know how to provide all the strategies and all those supports? Another activity that sometimes helps trigger those exclusive type of behaviors is that we don't include coworkers in any aspect of the employment process. We don't allow the employees to take breaks with others, that we often see where the job coach and the employee goes off on their own for their break or their lunch. And so those questions would arise, what happens during those times? Where are the other employees? The other big piece is to think about the hours or the schedules that the individual works. Quite often we know that the hours are the most critical part in the job negotiating aspect when we're going into the company, the part of that job development piece. So these are the kind of activities that really do make someone very exclusive. Obviously, we're going to end this presentation talking about what are the things we need to do to be more inclusive. But now's the time to think about, are you being inclusive with some of your behaviors or some of your strategies and activities that you do on the job site with the employee? Now we're going to move a little bit and think about, are we being intrusive? And sometimes exclusive and intrusive are very similar. And I think sometimes one of the words that I hear from coworkers that makes someone exclusive or intrusive is when I hear them say, oh, that's so-and-so, and that's Tom. He's part of that program. That is definitely an exclusive kind of approach to a company, that they are really not including the individual, or in some ways it could also be a little intrusive as well. So let's think about intrusive for a moment. The difference between exclusive and intrusive. Intrusive is to push, to force oneself upon others without being asked or welcomed, to impede another's progress, or to act as a barrier or an obstacle. So at this point, I think when we're on the job site, when we know that we haven't really excluded the employee with a disability on that job site, now I'm asking you to think about what are those things that you may be doing or may not be doing that is causing other coworkers or employees within that setting to consider you as being rather intrusive. I think the hard part here is that the fact that we are going on the job site with an individual is already being intrusive. And so we need to know that that is a given, and that with our presence we are being intrusive. But I think the motto I like to use a lot is that we need to do as much as necessary but as little as possible. But we have to make sure the individual is going to be successful. So therefore, what are some other things we need to be careful of that we may be doing that is causing us to be intrusive in that workplace? I think we could start with a little bit, about where we are ignoring the workplace culture, routines, or the traditions. Again, you're going to hear me talk, I mentioned about when we're being exclusive, but we can also, when we're intrusive, if we're really not paying attention to what that workplace culture is really like. Do people take coffee breaks in certain locations? Do people assist with paying for the coffee? Are there celebrations that go on a regular basis that we need to be a part of? Are there other routines or traditions in that culture that we have to ask about? Is there some informal structures that we don't know about? Who is the person in the workplace that really does have all the insight, rules, and regulations that sometimes aren't always written down? The employment specialist takes total control of all the training throughout the day. I'm going to be talking a lot more about this when we get to being more inclusive, but it really is that we're not including other people within that workplace to assist with the training, that the individual is right next to us and we're taking total responsibility. And I think that feeds into the next point here is about the employment specialist remaining next to the individuals throughout the break and the lunch. It's about how does the coworkers really penetrate the ability to get to that employee when they have another adult sitting next to them. And I think the two things we see happen sometimes is that the employee with the disability never gets to have those conversations or those dialogues because they're being ignored, or no one wants to approach them because they have this adult next to them. Or the other thing that happens sometimes is that the other coworkers end up talking to the job coach the whole time and ignoring the employee with the disability. And so at this point, it becomes so critical that we really begin facilitating those interactions. And again, when we get to that inclusive part, that the employment specialist or job coach really starts to remove themselves from that setting. The employment specialist continues to use that physical or verbal prompts, that we really begin with the most intrusive training approach versus looking at more of the natural approaches, the more natural cues, or that we never fade our prompting system and we really rely on those verbal prompts or someone giving those prompts. Or the employment specialist does it their way. I remember an example years ago when an employer looked at the job coach and said, you know what, I think things are going okay, but I really would like to try it without you here. And we were pretty early on into the job site training, and it was a little nerve-wracking for all, but of course I'm ready to say okay. And the job coach just looked at the employer and says, I'm sorry, we don't do it that way. We always have a job coach present. And again, it goes back to really understanding that employee, that employer, understanding that workplace culture, and knowing that when that does happen, we may need to come up with some backups because we may think, oh, something's going to happen, but I'm going to have to make sure I'm readily available to go in and assist that employer if they're going to need those supports. And I'm sure as you all are sitting with your colleagues and coworkers there, that you can come up with a number of examples that you have seen, or maybe you've even done, where you've become rather intrusive. I know that in my early days, I did the same. I made a lot of mistakes, and so now it's thinking about how do we not become exclusive or intrusive, and that we become more inclusive with our work to ensure that the individual is part of that workplace culture. So as we move to the inclusive part, we think about taking everything into account, that we want to make sure that everything is enclosed, to have as a part of a whole, to contain or compromise, and again, to take into account. That is really about being inclusive, making sure that individual is part of that workplace culture. And sometimes when we think about inclusive education, we sometimes think about the ABCs of inclusiveness. Is the person really being accepted by that workplace? Do they feel that sense of belonging, that they are definitely a part of that workplace culture? And are they feeling that they are part of the community of that culture, that they understand the routines and the customs, and they're a contributor to that workplace culture and feeling that part of that community? So now is really probably the meat of a lot of this presentation is what are we doing with how do we fade our job site supports, and what do we need to put in place to ensure that the person is successful? And again, I think the motto is we do as much as needed, but as little as possible. We want to make sure that person is successful, but let's not overdo it and cause exclusion or be intrusive. So here are some inclusive examples. Well, the first thing that we want to do is make sure that we start fading from the onset of the employment process. That the first day that we walk in, and I'm going to make the assumption that that individual wants you present, the employer wants you present. If it's an individual with a mental health diagnosis, that they've agreed to have an employment specialist present, and you've worked through the disclosure issues. But as we enter into that workplace, our first task is to figure out how are we going to get out of here. And so when we talk about fading from the onset, it's about thinking about what that individual is able to do on their own, do not need your assistance, and you're already removing yourself as much as possible, which goes into the next point of watching your physical positioning. That, again, with you just being present is a prompt, and it is intrusive. So that if an individual is capable of checking in or clocking in independently, then you could be backing away and maybe not even having to go into that area. Or maybe you just need to do it the first day, and then you could remove yourself from that area. That you're always trying to physically remove yourself and see how you could fade from even the littlest of tasks, including breaks and lunchtime. How are you utilizing coworkers in problem solving? It's definitely the critical point where if you want buy-in from coworkers, you're going to need to utilize coworkers throughout the employment process. And they know the ins and outs. You want to make sure that it's a coworker that has been around, that is well respected, both from coworkers as well as the supervisor. But they could give you a lot of good information of how to figure it out. And sometimes, even when you're trying to get that buy-in from the coworker, it's really good to even ask them when you already know the answer. Again, it helps you with some of the small dialogue or the chit-chatting and getting to know them, letting them get to know the employee as well as understanding why you're there. Look for opportunities to back away where the coworker is teaching the task or interacting. Especially if we're really partnering with coworkers and that they insist, and they're assisting in setting up the job site and maybe initially starting the teaching of the task, you could begin removing yourself and to ensure that those interactions are occurring between the employee and the coworker, and not between you and the coworker. And it's the same for the employee with the disability, that you want to make sure that they're asking those questions to the coworkers and not to you. So it's a very good strategy to think about very early on. I think one of the most difficult tasks of a job coach is trying to demystify your role and explain what you are doing and why you are there. I'm sure many of you have these great examples of when coworkers have come up to you and asked, are you there from headquarters? Are you there for watching them do their job? And so this is probably the most difficult aspect of trying to not only fade, but so that people understand your role. And I would really encourage you with your coworkers or your network of employment specialists or your supervisors to come up with some candid statements to be able to make to coworkers. Because here's the fine line. You have to be careful you're not doing any disclosure. And people are going to want to say to you, what's wrong with Tom? And if he has a disability, what's his disability? And so you know there's a lot of confidentiality issues that you have to think about. And you have to think about how do you present it in a very positive way. And it's probably something that you need to work with the employee with the disability and allow them to be able to tell people why you were present on the job site. It's a great way to encourage some self-advocacy and some self-determination. And it's something that really should be worked through prior to even going on a job site. The other thing to think about is to be overt. Ask coworkers to model a task or assist with training. And when I say overt, you may need to directly say, I need your help. Can you come and show Tom how to do this? Because I may not be able to be getting through to him. Or however it may be, but sometimes you may need to be as direct as possible that you need their help. Other times you may need to be covert, where you see some interaction going on, and you know by you being present, you're going to be that obstacle or that barrier, especially from the social relationship aspect. So this is a time that you can excuse yourself and say you need to go to the restroom, or that you need to make a phone call. Again, trying to just quietly remove yourself and really encourage that interaction. We do know, and some of the research shows, that one of the biggest barriers that is caused by having an employment specialist present is those social interactions. So we need to be really in tune to that and make sure we're facilitating those interactions as much as possible, and always making sure that we can have every teaching moment. Every time that that moment arises, that we make sure we are demonstrating it, we are modeling it, or that we really are facilitating those interactions between the coworkers and the employee with the disability. So let's talk a little bit more about some examples. Another rule of thumb, anytime you feel you need to be there, try to find another way. Create an adaptation, redesign a task, use some picture prompts, use coworkers. This is the point where it's real important that when an individual has become fairly independent on the job site, and you've been able to remove yourself from most of the task or most of the days, but there's a small portion of a task or a duty that's requiring some assistance. This is important to make sure that you put this in the ongoing support plan, so who's ever doing the follow-along knows this. But at this point, it may be coming up with some picture prompts. It may be coming up with some other compensatory strategies or self-management strategies that I'm going to mention later on. It may be asking coworkers if it's possible. So this is the point, that remember that if you're getting out of that job site, how are you going to get out of the job site if this is something that's causing you to remain? So again, thinking about another way. Make sure that the individual takes breaks and lunch with others. The trainers, the employment specialists, should leave unless it's absolutely necessary. And usually it's necessary only for the very beginning, the first day or two. Or if someone has some more challenging with social interactions or communication skills, that you may have to facilitate this. This is also the time that when we think about inclusiveness, I go back to that first exclusive slide, and when we talk about the hours, if you really stop and think about it, most individuals are more integrated in job settings based on the hours. If I'm only working 2 hours a day, the chances of me really taking a break or lunch with my other coworkers are going to be pretty slim, are going to be basically slim to none. So we know that hours are not only the key to increase wages and better outcomes, it's the key to integration. And so if you do have someone who's only working a couple hours a day and may miss those routine breaks and lunch in the job settings, you may need to think about what are some other ways that you can include the individual in the workplace culture. Maybe they come in a little bit earlier and take breaks with people, or they stay a little bit later a couple times a week to make sure they have lunch or a break with people. It's the only way they're going to really get to know their coworkers and be more part of that culture. The other piece to remember is to watch for those unwritten roles. An example I have is seating during lunch. And you all know, if you could even think about your own workplace, what are those unwritten rules that no one ever told you about? That when you go into the meeting, someone always sits on the first seat. Or that there's a group of people that always have lunch at a certain table every day, and you never dare go to that table. Or that someone always is in charge of bringing the donuts and they like it because that's their job. Those are the things that you never know in the orientation manual, and those are the things you're going to have to ask directly. What are some of the rules that some people just don't tell you about? So think about those in your own work setting. We talked a little bit about this, about how are we exclusive or even intrusive, but very critical of fading strategies and being inclusive is that we really have to have supervisors and coworkers involved from the onset. If we're going to have individuals really be a part of their workplace culture, and that employers and businesses take ownership, and that they don't say, oh, that's Tom from that program, we need to have supervisors and coworkers assisting from the very beginning. And we're finding more and more examples where employers are saying, we could try this. We want you around here, but let us try with the training. And they start the training, and if it gets a little bit too involved and that individuals need more time, that's when the job coach steps in. But again, we try to understand for that workplace, what is that typical training and orientation process so that we could supplement what they do, we don't supplant what they do. Probably a key to our fading is to fade systematically, and that we fade towards our natural cues. A few slides from now, I'm going to show an example of some data to show how we systematically have to fade ourselves, our prompts, and that we have to make sure we're fading towards those natural cues, such as if I'm a dishwasher and the dishes are piling up, the natural cue is, look, the dishes are piling up, I need to work faster. Or if the mail is piling up and I'm sorting the mail, that could be that cue that I need to work a little bit faster. Or the boss comes in, and I know that when I see the supervisor walking in, that I got to make sure that I'm busy. So again, what are those natural cues around us that could help serve as that prompt for the next step of the task or to initiate the task? And are we fading towards the natural cues? Are we removing ourselves as the job coach employment specialist and having the coworkers take over, providing maybe some of the prompts, or assisting the individual in the lunchroom or during break, or reminding when they need to remind them to go do a task. They're providing those prompts and supports and not us. And how are we fading ourselves from proximity and accessibility to the worker? One of the key elements that we always forget is that by being present, we are serving as a prompt. So I may not be giving a gesture, I may not be pointing, but with our present, we know the individual is more likely to respond correctly with us present than when we're not. And sometimes what happens, because we want to be such great helpers, we inadvertently provide a gesture and we point to the door or we point to the mailbox to help remind the person to go do that. And every time you do that and every time you're present, you need to ask yourself, what is this person going to do when I'm not present? And how are we moving from much less and less intrusive type of assistance and prompts? How are we going from that physical prompt to the verbal prompt, to us removing ourselves physically where they cannot see us anymore? That is what we talk about when we fade our prompts and fade ourselves systematically. What is the data telling you? And are you increasing the amount of time between the cues and prompts? This is where we talk about looking at, maybe we provide a verbal prompt and we say, Tom, you need to go get the mail. Then the next time we wait a little longer, we may wait 10 seconds or 15 seconds before we provide that prompt, and to see if Tom does that. And then the next time, and if he does it, we again try to increase the amount of time between the cues and the prompts. Again, that is fading our prompts. It's an incredibly powerful fading strategy, but sometimes we forget about the time, because if we continue to provide that prompt immediately, again, we're increasing that dependency. I'm briefly later going to be talking about some of the self-management strategies, but this is the time that as you're fading, that you may need to think about instituting some self-management and self-reinforcement strategies. I know we're not going to have enough time in this session to really go into details. I'm going to give some very, very brief examples. There's a lot of literature out there on self-management strategies. It's incredibly powerful. I know that we all use self-management strategies on a daily basis, and so when I get to that slide, I'll give some more of those type of examples. So systematic fading of our prompts and ourselves. Some things to think about. If we fade too fast, we're going to increase the worker's errors, which is going to cause us to have a longer training time. And again, our key to tell us when we need to fade is going to be what the data is telling us. But if we fade too slow, what we are really doing is foster worker dependence, and it's going to cause longer training time. And every time when I talk about fostering worker dependence, we really do talk about the employee with the disability becoming more reliant, more dependent on the job coach on that setting. But I also caution you that when we go too slowly and we're not watching our data, that sometimes the job coach gets very comfortable in that setting. I've gotten to know the coworkers, I've gotten to know the routines, and it's just starting to feel a little comfortable for me. And so they end up staying just a little bit longer out of their own dependency to the employee and or to that workplace. And if we're not systematic about it, we just do it because we think that the person's ready, what we tend to get is inconsistent worker performance, and which will end up requiring longer training time. When we think about fading our prompts and fading our train and end up with longer training time, the three things I think about is one, when I'm on a job site too long and they're not increasing their independence and their performance, or we're not putting some level of supports in those areas when they're having some difficulty, those adaptations, as I mentioned before, I first go back to make sure it was a good job match. But when we know it's a good job match, that we've done a really good person-centered approach, and we've done we really did a good job analysis, and we've really done a good match between what is required of the job setting and what the individual strengths and talents are, then I've got to look at how we're training. And 9 out of 10 times, it's about not being systematic. And when we think about being systematic, we're not using our data to tell us when we need to provide more prompts and when we need to fade. And it's usually that we start fading either too fast or too slow, and what we end up with is inconsistent worker performance. So let's just take a couple minutes and let's think about some data collection methods and why we should collect data. I know there's a lot of people out there that know that this is the key to their instruction, and I also know a lot of people say to me, it's just too time consuming. And so I want to go through some points of why it's very important to collect data. But before I do that, I want to make sure people know that when we are collecting data, we need to be as unobtrusive as possible. We don't want to be intrusive there because nobody walks in a job site with a clipboard or a stopwatch. Although we could walk in on a job site with data collection forms that we put in our pockets or in our purse, and that we write down the data in a very, very inconspicuous way so that we are not highlighting the individual. Again, we know that's not natural, we know it's not typical, we know it's an incredibly important strategy. So how do we do that without being intrusive upon the individual? So why should you collect some data? Well, the key is that it provides the record of the worker's performance. I can't tell you the number of times having data about the worker's performance has saved many individuals' jobs. Because when an employer has said to me they're not meeting production, I could show them where they are. I've also been able to save jobs where an employer has said to me, I'll give you 1 month and this person's gone. And I've been able to say, give me 2 weeks, let's look at the data, and when we can decide. It obviously is an objective evaluation of the individual's performance. It shows when it's time to fade and when we need continued training. And I'm going to give an example of that in a couple more slides. But this talks about my instruction. What am I doing? How am I doing? When do I need to do it? The data is telling me. It calls attention to the areas that may need different training methods, adaptations, or self-management systems. These are the task or parts of the task or of the duty that really is challenging us as instructors or as job coaches. And the data tells us I need some help. It's a great way that you can go back into your office, ask your coworkers, ask your supervisors, and say, I'm stuck here. So then this is where we need to get to some of our compensatory strategies, our different kind of a method of teaching. Maybe we need to think about some adaptations, or more importantly, is there some self-management strategies that we could teach the individual and then we can get out of the job site. It can be used as a reinforcement tool for the worker. I will tell you that because as a job coach years ago, I used to graph a lot of the data, especially the productivity data. And I always used it as a feedback to the worker to tell them how they were doing. I would show them where we needed to be. We needed to get, let's say if I'm vacuuming and I needed to vacuum within a half hour and it was taking them 40 minutes or 45 minutes, I would highlight on the bar where we needed to be so they know they could work, continue to work quicker, and they could see if they're improving or not. So it was a feedback tool for me. It also could be used with employers and coworkers. Again, if you need assistance, for feedback, for new ideas. Again, bringing the coworkers and supervisors in for some problem solving. When you're really stuck, you could show the data and say, what else can I do? And most importantly, it serves as that accountability tool to funders, management, and individuals and their families. I know that many of you have had to go back to your major funding source, usually vocational rehabilitation, and say, I need another 20 hours, we're making progress, they're doing better, or I need another 50 hours, but we're not there yet. Sitting in that seat of vocational rehabilitation, I would have to ask you, how do you know? And they should be asking, how do you know? And you can't be just saying, because I know. Show them the data. Show them the progress. Show them how they're improving and that you need some more time. And this is what you're doing to make sure that you're going to reach the level of performance the individual needs to perform. So usually when we think about data collection, we think about it in two ways. But the area that I always say, there are people who like to collect data just for the sake of collecting data. And do not do that. If a person is already performing the job independently, you don't need to collect the data, don't collect it. It should be meaningful, it should be simple to use, it should be very easy to read and easy to interpret. So we want to keep it to the basic, and again, we need to keep it useful about how we're teaching, how we're giving feedback, and how we can increase the performance of the individual. Basically, how are they doing? And there are probably two terminologies that you think about in data collection. One is probe data, and that is used to find out how the worker is doing without any intervention, any prompts, or any reinforcement. The other type of data we collect is trial data, and that you can think about is how you are instructing the individual. It's used when we're training on the one-on-one to show where a worker is having difficulty in performing specific steps. It shows the level of prompting you're needing to use on that task. And so the next slide shows an example. And if you look under the 10-4 and you see the minuses, that is the probe data. Went in, did not provide any instruction and said, okay, go get the film and deliver the film. You gave the prompt of the task, and they weren't able to do it. So that there you know you're going to need to instruct on each steps. The next day you begin your instruction, or what we call the trial data, and here you could see that the individual needed, out of the 5 steps, and again this is a very simple example, 5 verbal prompts and 1 physical prompt. Then the next day you see the individual really got it, and you see that the first 2 steps they were able to do independently, and the last 2 steps. This is your signal that you could start fading. Remember the physical proximity? You could start removing yourself next to the individual and allowing them to do it independently, being far enough away that you could see what they're doing, but close enough that you could step in and provide the prompt when needed, as in number 3, needing a verbal prompt. Then again, you could see as the individual is learning the task, it is not only telling you about your instruction, but it's telling you that you could begin fading from that task, from that physical area or the day. So if an individual is able to independently do the first 2 tasks of the day, you shouldn't be around. You should be fading yourself, and then step in on those tasks they're needing assistance with. And then within the task, you should be fading yourself. Again, following the data, and when you see they're able to do it independently, you're starting to remove yourself physically. This is very, very important, because what we tend to see is individuals, as they're doing it independently, someone is still standing next to them. And what we are doing is encouraging that dependency, because you're still serving as that prompt. And in some settings, it becomes difficult. And that is the key, that when you go into the setting, you need to be able to see where can you remove yourself and be far enough away where the individual may not see you or depend on you, but close enough that you could step in when needed. I wish I had lots more time to talk about self-management strategies, a key to really promoting independence. And, you know, we all use self-management strategies in our everyday life, and I can't imagine there's anybody in this world that doesn't. And I'm going to give some very, very quick examples, and I would encourage you to check the literature, or if you email Terry or myself, I'd be happy to share some of the literature and examples. Some stimulus control techniques, those are the things where we sometimes, we want to be faced with the item what we have to remember to do. And I always think about this is when I forget to return my audio tapes to the library. So what I tend to do is leave them on the seat of my car so I'm faced with it and I know that I will return it. Or sometimes for individuals that we make sure that at the end of the day when they go home, whatever they take to work every day, they put all in one spot, like their name badge, and maybe it's their key and their ID card, so they know everything is there in one place and they're faced with that stimulus to take with them the next day. Antecedent cue regulations, a lot of us do this. Picture prompts, checklist, but the picture prompts are probably the most widely used antecedent cue, and it prompts us through the steps of the task. Also, audio prompts. When you are listening to music, there's a couple research studies out there, you listen to music and it's interspersed with the prompts to remind the person to do the step. Self-monitoring and self-evaluation is very closely related, and it's about checking off the steps of the task or the job duties of the day, maybe using picture prompts to know they've done every step they're supposed to do. With self-evaluation, you compare it to some set of criteria. So if you're mopping a floor, that would be what is the amount of time it should be taking to do that floor. And then self-instruction, there's been some research about problem solving, but it's about individuals quietly saying the steps of their task or doing some problem solving steps that they have, such as I'm out of glass cleaner, what do I need to do? I need to get more glass cleaner. I go and get more glass cleaner, now I have it. So it's about doing some verbalization with the individual. A very powerful tool, a very effective tool, and I know we use it on a regular basis with ourselves, telling us what we need to do in our daily work. And I'd like to end a little bit with, when we talk about our quality again of our job sites, when is good enough enough? And if you think about the curse of good enough, if 99% is good enough, which we always say, if we talk about some of the objectives that we use for individuals, we say 80% is good enough. But think about if we said 99% is good enough. Then 12 newborns would go to the wrong parents each day. 18,322 mishandled mail items per hour. 2 million documents would be lost a year by the IRS. Too bad it couldn't be my taxes. 2.5 million books be shipped miscovered each year. 20,000 incorrect drug scripts each year, and over 800,000 credit cards are wrongly magnetized. When is good enough enough? So when we think about employment and we think about the practices we do, good enough in employment means would mean that a job match is less than perfect. That 99%, if we think about is that enough, that job match would be less than perfect. An employer would be less than invested. An employee is less than contributing, and a wage is less than typical. We would think about a safety issue is less than secured against. A support structure is less than sturdy, and our work file is less than accurate. Therefore, what we need to do is make sure that we do the best of the best practices. And in order to do that, we need to ensure that our job match between the consumer and the job site analysis is as perfect as we possibly can get. Especially, we need to identify those non-negotiables. We need to make sure that job is extraordinary typical for that specific employer or that employment setting. What is typical in that setting will not be typical in another setting. So do we understand that workplace cultures? That we understand that relationships are interdependent, that none of us are totally dependent, and that we rely on each other to support us throughout our days, throughout our weeks. So how do we foster that interdependency in that workplace? That the language that we use really reflects equity and capacity, that we use that person-centered and that person-first language, and we really are building upon the individual's strengths and capacities. That all the strategies that we are using on the job site are or our strategies and our activities really flow from a very quality assessment. And that the job that you have is one that you would like for your own loved one, that it is of the highest quality. So I end with also, we think about the job is non-seasonal in a stable or growing industries, and it allows for evolution. The individual has the opportunity to grow, and it has many enhancing features. And the expectations of the performance are clearly defined, and that they're stable, and that we've worked closely with the employer to understand what it is that they expect. That the employer is committed to diversity, that they are warm and welcoming, that the coach has probed data and ongoing communication with the job site, that we've utilized our data and our fading and communicated with that supervisor. And the coach tries to find other ways to fund extensive supports like attendant care and or transportation. So I end with stealing from my colleagues from Trans-Cen when they did a survey, and they said employer and values supported employment providers that are educated, that they understand the best practices, they understand how businesses work and how to support businesses, that they are knowledgeable, that they make frequent contacts and follow-up, and they really spend time getting to know the company and getting to know the workplace culture. They value where providers understand the job requirements, those expectations and demands, and they really know the applicant's abilities and strengths. And most importantly and finally, that they respond quickly, that they provide that customer service in a way that we would want to have responded by our doctors and our dentists and any other plumbers. It's a good quality customer service, and in order for us to do that, we have to really know the company and we have to really know our applicants. Thank you all. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to talking to you on the web.